Published 1359 EDT, the 15th of August 2017. Updated 1622 EDT, the 15th of August 2017. Kim Jong-un is holding captive a U.S. Navy vessel almost 50 years since it was seized by his grandfather's communist regime, precipitating a crisis with echoes of the current standoff between Donald Trump and North Korea. The USS Pueblo and its crew were captured by North Korea in 1968, and it is the only U.S. Navy vessel still in active commission that is officially listed as captive. Now it is more than just a captive vessel, it is also being used by Kim's own regime as a museum of anti-American propaganda on Potong River in the nation's showcase capital, Pyongyang. Its existence has been documented by award-winning photojournalist Mark Edward Harris, who has traveled to the Korean peninsula multiple times to capture the delicate balancing act between democratic South Korea and its authoritarian neighbor to the north. The U.S.-North Korea impasse, which has simmered since the end of the Korean War in 1953, has grown more tense this month over fears that the North's nuclear weapons program is nearing the ability to target the U.S. mainland. Pyongyang tested 2 intercontinental ballistic missiles last month, and on Tuesday Kim announced he was standing back from his threat of an imminent attack on Guam, but the official state news agency said that if the Yankees persist in their extremely dangerous, reckless actions on the Korean peninsula and in its vicinity, testing the self-restraint of the DPRK, the latter will make an important decision, as it already declared. Captive, the USS Pueblo remains a commissioned Navy ship that is in a dock in Pyongyang, being used as a museum to anti-American sentiment by Kim Jong-un's secretive regime. His grandfather's forces captured it in 1968. Museum to the enemy. The North Koreans have turned the USS Pueblo into a showcase of its distrust for the West. On board, North Koreans are shown photographs from the capture in 1968, and the original intelligence-gathering equipment evidence. The Pueblo, which is guarded by North Korean sailors in its dock in Pyongyang, has files on display which the North Koreans say are evidence of its involvement in clandestine activity. They have not been authenticated. View from the bridge. The USS Pueblo had been built as an army supply freighter in 1944, and transferred to the Navy in 1966, where it was commissioned as an intelligence-gathering ship a year later. The North Koreans have preserved it, but it remains a commissioned Navy vessel. How they defied the Communists. Crew members of the Pueblo were photographed by North Korea for propaganda purposes and appeared with their middle fingers extended, telling their captors it was a Hawaiian greeting. When they realized they were being mocked, the North Koreans imposed harsh captivity conditions. Crisis. Kim Il-sung was photographed in September 1968 basking in applause from his followers. At the time, his regime was deeply involved in negotiations over the Pueblo, with one senior congressman calling for LBJ to threaten a nuclear war reunion. The crew of the Pueblo were sent across the bridge of no return in the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas on December 23, 1968, after spending almost the whole year in captivity. Official record. The entire crew were photographed as a group at the Balboa Naval Hospital in San Diego after their return. They had been flown to the U.S. for health checks after months of ill treatment in North Korea, but in 1968, it came as close to boiling point as any time since the armistice which ended the war, in a standoff which was known as the Pueblo Crisis, but which has received little attention thanks to an accident of timing. The ship was seized in 1968, just a week before one of the largest military actions of the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive. Still commissioned, the Pueblo is the only Navy ship listed as captive and remains a part of the fleet. As a result, the Korean peninsula had been divided by the Soviet Union and the U.S. into independent North and South at the end of the Second World War. The North Korean army, supported by the Soviets, invaded South Korea in June 1950. The U.S. stepped in to defend South Korea in a police action, and the conflict escalated as China and the Soviet Union became involved. The ultimate death toll is estimated at 2.5 million, the vast majority civilian. An armistice was signed in 1953 to suspend combat and exchange prisoners of war, but it was not a permanent peace treaty. Nor did the agreement curb North Korea's aggression under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current dictator, Kim Jong-un. He turned to random acts of terrorism instead of all-out war. These acts included the hijacking of a South Korean airliner while on approach to a Seoul airport by agents from the north in February 1958. The passengers and crew were released a month later. On January 22, 1968, North Korean agents attempted to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-gi. That set off a chain of events, and the following day, the USS Pueblo, which was not aware of the assassination attempt, was intercepted by North Korea. It was gathering signals intelligence on North Korea, but also looking for what Soviet submarines were up to in international waters nearby. Trophy. The North Korean propaganda machine has preserved the Pueblo exactly as it was when they captured it in January 1968, and highlights the bullet holes for visitors. Something of the sailors' conditions are kept too in the bunks on show below deck. Part of history. The Pueblo Museum in Pyongyang shows photographs of the body of fireman Dwayne Hodges, the sole casualty of the crisis, being repatriated from North Korea. Reunited surviving crew members, and Rose Bufha, the widow of Captain Lloyd Bufha, gathered for the 40th anniversary of the capture of the Pueblo on the Spirit of Ethan Allen, on Lake Champlain, Vermont. Next year will be the 50th anniversary. Mark Edward Harris photographed the surviving crew members of the Pueblo, and the widow of the captain. They are top row, left to right. Rose Bufha, widow of Captain Lloyd Bufha. Sergeant Robert Hammond, U.S. Marine Corps fireman Stephen Wilkinson. Timothy Harris, Petty Officer First Class. Policarpo Pola. P.P. Garcia, Petty Officer First. Norbert Klepak. Second row from top, left to right. Petty Officer Second. Donald McLaren, Petty Officer Third. Willie Bussell, Petty Officer Third. Paul Bruce Nahan, Seaman. Stephen Ellis, Seaman. Edward Russell, Petty Officer Third. Seaman. Charles H. Crandall. Third row from top, left to right. Seaman Robert Hill, Petty Officer Second. Ronald Behrens, Seaman. Earl Fairs, Petty Officer First. Donald Peppard, Fireman. Thomas Massey, Petty Officer Third. Ralph Reed. Fourth row from top, left to right. Petty Officer Third. Bradley Crowe, Petty Officer Third. Darrell Wright, Petty Officer First. Frank Ginder, Petty Officer First. Michael Barrett, Petty Officer First. Donnie Bailey, Lieutenant Junior Grade F. Carl Schumacher. Fifth row from top, left to right. Petty Officer Third. John Grant. Sergeant Robert Chicker, U.S. Marine Corps, Petty Officer Third. Ralph McClintock. Stephen Harris, LT. Edward Murphy, LT. Petty Officer Third. Alvin Plucker. Bottom row. Oceanographer Dunny Fryer Tuck. Chief Petty Officer James Kell. Fireman Peter Bandera. Fireman Norman Spear. Oceanographer Harry Iredale. Seaman Richard Rogala. Ranks as held at time of becoming prisoners of war. Propaganda tools. The North Koreans released details of what they claimed was the position of the Pueblo when it was taken captive and its crew held prisoner. They were in high spirits when they finally made it back to friendly soil, having been flown from the DMZ to Seoul, where they were greeted by senior officers. The Communists claimed the Americans had sailed into their territorial waters and attacked with submarine chases, torpedo boats and 2 MiG-21 fighter jets. One subchaser opened fire on the U.S. ship, killing fireman Dwayne Hodges. The U.S. Navy was adamant that the Pueblo, a Banner-class ship which had been attached to Navy intelligence for spying purposes, was in international waters, but, under threat and virtually unarmed compared to the forces she faced, the Pueblo surrendered, giving its crew time to attempt to destroy some of the high volumes of sensitive information on board. Its captain, Lloyd Bufha, was ordered to shore by the North Koreans and the boat was seized in the port city of Wonsan, where the crew were tied up, blindfolded and beaten. In Washington, D.C., President Lyndon Johnson's White House and prominent members of Congress were at odds on what to do next. The chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Democrat Mendel Rivers, suggested that President Johnson threaten North Korea with nuclear attack if they did not return the boat. Others cautioned against aggravating the situation, fearing the Pueblo crew would be killed by the reclusive regime. Johnson decided to damp down the crisis, and it was largely overshadowed by the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which unfolded at the same time as negotiations over the Pueblo's crew. North Korea released propaganda photographs and films of their American prisoners, but the men undermined their captors by flicking the middle finger, and then the servicemen were transported to prisoner of war camps where they were starved and tortured. Theme Park. The Pueblo is part of the Victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum in Pyongyang, an attempt to show the power of the isolated regime left. Elsewhere in the city are other memorials, and anti-American postcards are widely available and other artifacts. This hatchet was used in the Panmunjom Max murders, when North Koreans in the DMZ murdered Amory Cap, Arthur Boniface and 1st LT Mark Barrett as they led service workers trimming a tree. North Korea propaganda carefully preserves its portrayal as well as the Pueblo. The Victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum includes representations of the war which ended with armistice in 1953, with the North Koreans being portrayed as moving forward to victory. Indoctrination. Militarism is built into the North Korean culture from the earliest moments, with even a children's playground in Sonbong an opportunity to tell the regime's subjects of its might. The Arirang mass games are another opportunity for military displays, with children holding up the placards to create a giant mural in the stands. Reality: the dilapidated state of North Korea is apparent in this image of a group of soldiers on Mount Baktu, which is sacred to all Koreans. Remembered Kim Jong-un exploits his grandfather's memories, such as at this military parade for Kim Il-sung's birthday centennial in 2012. As part of his grip on North Korean association, Kim Jong-un's statue is placed beside that of his grandfather in central Pyongyang. Being associated with the founder of North Korea so strongly is part of his effort to prevent challenges to his power. Unusual site: the Koryo Hotel, where foreigners are able to stay in Pyongyang, has limited access to the outside world's media. But North Koreans do not get to see the leader on Western broadcasts' modern image. Kim Jong-un pushes his people to believe the country is modern, with himself at the head of it. His image is used by the regime, while museums like the Three Revolution exhibition portray North Korea as a cutting-edge country. Celebrations' fireworks inevitably carried political overtones. In 2012, Kim Jong-un's regime marked the 100th anniversary of the purported date of his grandfather's birth with coordinated displays in all the major cities, including these in Kaesong. Applauded as the supreme power in North Korea, Kim Jong-un wants to be treated with deference by his people, even the highest-ranking military officers. The regime released this photograph on Tuesday after it was taken in Monday as Kim inspected the command of the strategic force of the Korean People's Army. Reality of a divided peninsula: the military demarcation line at Panmunjom. Photograph from the North Korean side. On the other sides, tourists are free to visit and its people to come and go, but on the northern side, life is very different. CPT Buffer was psychologically tortured, including being put before a fake firing squad. He finally agreed to confess under duress to spying when the North Koreans said they would execute his men in front of him. But even then, in his handwritten confession he included an act of defiance against the regime. "We pee in the DPRK North Korea. We pee in the great leader Kim Il-sung," he stated, the North Koreans being unaware that peon is almost pronounced peon and that it is never used as a verb. 11 months after being taken prisoner, the crew were released following protracted negotiations between the two countries. The release of the POWs was secured by an apology from the U.S. and a written statement that the USS Pueblo had been spying. The Navy and Marine Corps servicemen walked from captivity on December 23, 1968, across the Bridge of No Return to the Korean Demilitarized Zone on the border with South Korea, where their a recommendation was made by Navy Court of Inquiry to court-martial Captain Buff and the officer in charge of research, Lt. Stephen Harris. The Secretary of the Navy rejected the recommendation because the men had suffered enough. Buff had continued his unblemished naval career until retirement, when he left with the ranks of commander. The surviving crew members of the USS Pueblo held a reunion aboard the Spirit of Ethan Allen on Lake Champlain, Vermont in 2008, to mark the 40th anniversary of their ship's capture. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of one of the less told stories of U.S. history. Ralph McClintock, who was a petty officer third class on the USS Pueblo, shared his thoughts this month of the current crisis between North Korea and the U.S. "The best thing the U.S. administration could do is to shut the F up," he said. "Keep our president's mouth shut. I vote to completely ignore everything North Korea does. In other words, scare the bloody bejesus out of them with silence." Mark Edward Harris' latest book, The Travel Photo Essay Describing a Journey Through Images, will be published by Routledge in September and is available for pre-order on Amazon.